like a Hellcat.
Before we get started, I have a favor. If you enjoy my content and want to see me continue to improve in both quality and size, please check out my Patreon linked in the description. Any amount helps and it is greatly appreciated. There are so many rewards for each level of donation, so go check it out. Now back to the video. Recently, Blizzard's Jeff Kaplan opened up and described a potential future experiment and experimental card where instead of adjusting the off tanks like Roadhog to have more team defensive utility like the main tanks possess, as with the 3 DPS 2 support 1 tank experimental card, they would instead try pushing main tanks in the direction of off tanks like Roadhog, making them more self-tanky and deal more damage. This in theory is a great idea and would allow for better balance. Pull power away from double barrier, killing the comp, and makes the tanks a whole lot more inviting, which would increase the tank player base, and reduce the tank queue time. However, I am of the opinion that this method and line of thinking would potentially throw diversity of tanks out the window, and lacking the main tank dynamic would shift the genre of the tank side of the game from a MOBA FPS where skill and ability management and defending your team means a lot more than pure damage to more of an FPS sort of style. And that sort of feels like a cop-out solution to me, basically turning the tanks into beefy DPSs. Despite this, I do want to theorycraft and offer my ideas for how I would rework the main tanks of the game to be more like off tanks. So without any further ado, welcome to Reworking Overwatch. Firstly, I want to look at Roadhog and D.Va, mainly because I'm not happy with their current position of balance right now. First with D.Va, this is quite a minor fix. I want to increase the cooldown of the defense matrix by 2 seconds. In its current form, it's way too oppressive, being almost impossible to find a chance to get damage or an ability into play. At this state, it works more like a barrier with a cooldown. Outside of this, I think she's in good standing. With Roadhog, as I always suggest, a passive called Bodyguard that provides 15% resistance to all allies within a 6 meter radius of him. And up next is a defensive effect on Take a Breather that heals allies within the same 6 meter AoE for 25 HPS for 4 seconds. Outside of that, him being the poster off tank and bruiser means he's in overall good standing. Now to the main tanks. First we have good old glorious Reinhardt. The first and most unfortunate change with this rework is the reduction of his barrier health. If the goal of this experiment is to make all tanks off tanks, changes to barrier health must occur. For Reinhardt, the barrier will be reduced from 1600 health to 1250 health. It still needs to be large since it is a core element of his kit, but making it weaker will require him to use his body to block damage while in a brawl instead of his barrier. The regen of the barrier would also be reduced to 150 health per second. Since the primary part of this rework is making all the main tanks more viable in direct combat, I do want to increase Rein's health, for outside of his barrier, unlike Orisa and Sigma, he does not have a secondary self-sustained defensive ability. So I want to increase his armor to 300, leaving him with a total health pool of 600. The next change in this rework will reintroduce a few buffs to Reinhardt that came with an experimental card. The first is buffing the damage of Rocket Hammer to 90 damage, up from 75. This will allow him to take duels and deal more damage, and in addition to the next change, which is buffing Steadfast from 30% to 50% crowd control resistance, should allow him to battle on the front line without being the weakest link when it comes to damage, and survive being knocked around, considering a lot of these changes will involve the aforementioned crowd control in one way or another. My final change to Reinhardt is to give his Fire Strike a minor knockback to enemies that hit. My final change to Reinhardt is to give Fire Strike a minor knockback to enemies it hits, maybe 3 to 5 meters. When I was debating the change for Fire Strike, I was stuck between adding a knockback or adding a brief fire damage over time effect quite similar to Ashe with Dynamite. But I thought, firstly, this was a bit too on the nose, and secondly, it may be a bit too strong on top of the Rocket Hammer's damage buff, so I went with knockback. I believe with this set of changes, Reinhardt will become more of a bruiser, in the same vein as Roadhog or Zarya, while still retaining the allure and identity of his current form. Up next is Winston. Now, Winston is an interesting situation since he isn't a typical main tank. The only part of his kit that makes him one is his barrier, and generally lower damage than most off-tanks. However, he still does fit into the off-tank role as well, so his rework will be minor. I will add 2 abilities into his missing secondary fire and passive slots. For the passive, I want to give him something called Hard Landing. This would work just like the effect that occurs whenever Winston lands after using Jump Pack. As long as he is 5 meters off the ground, upon impact he will deal 1 to 50 damage in a 5 meter radius. This would give him a roundabout counter to the crowd control for if he is thrown up into the air, upon landing he will deal damage to the enemies around him, and maybe even the one who threw him into the air to begin with. For secondary fire, I want to give him the Primal Punch ability I've mentioned in the original Reworking Tanks video. This is a weaker version of Doomfist's Rocket Punch. It will not have a charge up time, instead it will have a cast time similar to Flashbang. It will deal 75 damage to enemies within a 6 meter 90 degree cone in front of him, knocking them back 3 to 5 meters. Hitting a wall or terrain will not deal extra damage, however. This will have a 6-second cooldown, although that might be a bit too low, so 7 or 8 seconds might be required. Still able to be used often and deal substantial damage, but not being oppressive or overwhelming. His shield's low uptime and health already keep it in check, so I don't believe it requires any further adjustments, and his ultimate Primal Rage already works well as a disruption ability similar to Roadhog's Whole Hog. I believe that this rework will grant Winston some damage potential required to step in the ring with the rest of the off-tanks, and perform on par. This rework may attract Doomfist and Genji players with the mobility and burst damage of his new kit. Up now is the Madman Sigma. First we will deal with his barrier. Reducing its health to 750 from 900 should suffice. Regen would also have to be reduced to 100 HPS. Next I want to increase his base health pool. He is a massive hitbox for such a low health hero. This is explained away by him possessing 2 defensive abilities, one of which is able to increase his max health for a short period of time, but if he's going to be more offensive and in frontline combat, this needs to be better. Since he has shields and not armor, 600 health is not required, so doubling his player shields to 200, making for a grand total of 500, should be a fair and safe number. The final change to Sigma is a passive attached to the use of his other abilities. This new passive will generate a field of low gravity or slow effect within a 6 meter radius around him when he's using Accretion or Kinetic Grasp or Experimental Barrier. That reduces enemy player speed by 30%. This would do many things. Slow enemies that are close to him while he's using Accretion to help line up a shot, or during Kinetic Grasp to track an enemy absorb as much damage as possible. This rework should make Sigma more tanky and able to survive close encounters with flankers, and I think Sigma already has passable damage, being quite high already. However, buffing the Hypersphere's damage to 75 from 55 may be needed to keep him in par with the other tanks. Also allowing his Accretion Rock to deal damage scaling with distance, again, may do good as well. I hope these changes will make Sigma a lot more self-sufficient, as well as able to duel tanks more effectively, since he's currently best at dealing with squishies. Lastly is Orisa. For her, there are 4 minor changes. First, because of her large hitbox, setting her base health to 250 for a grand total of 500 health is a good option. Second is reducing her barrier health to 500, down from 600, because of course we are trying to kill barriers apparently. Up now is the Gallop passive that has been mentioned by several members of the community. Upon spawning or after 3 seconds of not attacking or taking damage, Orisa will begin moving at double movement speed. It's pretty straightforward from there. Despite not being a true main tank, the only thing anchoring her in that position is her barrier. So having a weaker barrier and more health and mobility would allow her to keep up with the other off-tanks. She may still be lacking in damage output, so potentially granting her primary fire a 1 to 5 damage splash effect within a meter or so of impact may be what she needs. With this, she'd be able to do more damage when enemies are grouped up than she currently does. She would then be able to utilize her own halt ability to much greater effect and results. Now, like I said, I think making all tanks work like off-tanks is cheap and a bad idea. But I do like the route of more of a middle ground concept. So on top of the changes that have been made so far, I have a few additional defensive changes that will be in order. First, Reinhardt's passive will extend to allies within a 6 meter radius around him while he is using Barrier Field. They must be behind the barrier, however. Next is Orisa's Fortify. Similar to Reinhardt, the effects will extend to her allies within a 6 meter radius, but to a 50% reduction in effect. Now for Sigma and Hammond, the personal shields added by both Kinetic Grasp and Adaptive Shields also apply to allies within the same 6 meter radius, to a 50% reduction of power. Overall, I think these series of changes and reworks could be good for the tanks overall, even if we aren't trying to move them all to off-tanks, but I do think if we are trying to move them all to off-tanks, going full force in this direction, these changes may be a good starting point. But what do you guys think? Feel free to tell me in the comment section down below. As always, thank you all for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Follow my socials. Keep up the channel. Go to my Discord. Join the conversation Patreon if you feel like supporting me. It's EmeraldAvenger. Have a nice day. Stay safe. Peace out.